Welcome to the Philos Project podcast. I'm your host, Dominique Hoffman, and over the next few weeks, I'm going to take you with me on the ground for the conversations I had with Israelis as myself and my colleague, Isaac Woodward, went on a solidarity and humanitarian trip to Israel. We led 16 young Christian professionals on our Philos Leadership Institute trip, and we witnessed what happened on October 7th, the horrific destruction and damage, the psychological warfare that still continues, and the resilience of those living in Israel who have all been affected by this war and by the October 7th attacks. These conversations are touching, they are difficult, and they bear witness to what happened, and I hope that we never forget. This week, we're going to talk with Shadi Khalloul, who is a Maronite Christian living in Israel. He's active in Israeli political life, and with Isaac Woodward, who leads our Philos Leadership Institute trips. While me and Isaac were on the ground in Israel last week, we spoke with Shadi in response to Tucker Carlson's recent interview with Munther Isaac, where he essentially makes the claim that Christians are persecuted under the Israeli government, and therefore Christians in the West, in the United States, should not support the U.S.-Israel strategic alliance and the United States' involvement in the current war between Israel and Hamas. And he makes this claim by speaking to Munther Isaac, who is a Palestinian bishop living in Bethlehem, and he clearly holds radical theological beliefs, sympathetic probably to the Palestinian liberation theology. Munther Isaac fell short of celebrating the October 7th attacks. He did justify the attacks as a legitimate form, or what happens under the occupation, a form of resistance. And I would argue that Munther Isaac's view of the attacks and it's just deplorable, barbaric and immoral acts that day of murder in cold blood, of genocide, is very contrary to Christian values. And so I find it quite interesting that Tucker Carlson would interview Munther Isaac, who holds very radical theological opinions and who doesn't even live in Israel. I want to point out he lives in Bethlehem in the West Bank, which is run by the Palestinian Authority. And in the West Bank and in Gaza, Christians hold essentially second-class status. This is part of Sharia law. Christians are people of the book along with Jews, so they're not forced to convert to Islam, but they're essentially second-class citizens. They hold dhimmi status in Gaza, for example, and you can't marry outside of your Christian community. So if you're a Christian, you can't marry a Muslim, and because of that, the Christian populations in the West Bank and in Gaza are greatly diminishing. Since 2005, since Israel's unilateral withdrawal from Gaza, the Christian population in Gaza has gone from 3,000 to a little less than 1,000 today, and that's just in one generation. And Tucker Carlson paints this as the fault of Israel. And in doing so, he becomes very sympathetic to critical theory, which is very Marxist in nature, which is ironic for a man who claims to hold very conservative values. And he fails to compare the lived experience of Christians in Israel to that of those in the West Bank and in Gaza, again, run by the PA and Hamas, respectively, and for Christians in the larger region. So quickly, I want to tell you about what happened on April 9th of this year. Pasquale Suleiman was found dead. He was kidnapped from his home in Lebanon, and he was brutally murdered for opposing Hezbollah. He was a Christian, and he paid the ultimate price for speaking out because, again, he does not have the freedom of speech, of free religious expression. And even though Lebanon is technically supposed to be a Christian nation, Hezbollah, who runs the country essentially as a de facto government, does not allow for freedom of speech or opposition to the organization. And he paid the ultimate price. Now, his lived experience greatly contrasts that of other Maronite Christians living just over the border in Jish, for example, where Shadi's community is from, where they can live freely, worship freely. And so the only thing that's different between Pasquale's life and between Shadi's life is the border in between them. They're both Maronite Christians. They're indigenous to the land. But under Hezbollah, Pasquale paid the ultimate price for speaking out. And in Israel, Shadi is an active member in political life in the Knesset. ran for the Knesset. And I think that highlights the difference for Christians outside of Israel and is the reason that Israel has the largest growing Christian population in the Middle East. And the rest of the region has essentially eradicated or ethnically cleansed indigenous Christians from their home. So again, Israel is the only democracy in the region. They have freedom to religiously express themselves. Even as a Christian going to Israel, I prayed at the Wailing Wall next to other Jewish women. We had Shabbat dinner and broke bread with a Jewish family. The relationship between Jews and Christians is robust, and not that it's perfect or flawless, but I would say that life for a Christian in Israel is just as free as someone who's Muslim or Jewish, in that you can practice your faith, you can freely speak out against the government, you have freedom of movement, all of which is not offered to Christians in the West Bank or in Gaza under, again, the PA and Hamas, which Tucker fails to distinguish in his interview. So to further unpack this, I'm first going to speak with Isaac Woodward, and then we're going to turn to our interview from On the Ground with Shadi in Israel. Welcome to the podcast, Isaac. So happy to have you. I would love if you could just introduce yourself to the audience, maybe a little bit about your background in DC, how long you've been with Philos, what you do at Philos would be great.
Thanks. Yeah, great to be on here, Dominique. It's exciting to just wrap up our Philos Leadership Institute trip that we do twice per year to Israel alongside you and other colleagues. So I have been at the Philos Project since 2020, working primarily in our Leadership Institute. My title is Director of the Institute. This program takes students who've completed our online Pathfinder courses and then applied through a few different mechanisms over to Israel for an 8-day trip. And prior to that, they'll do 10 weeks of curriculum study remotely, where we'll cover a lot more of the topics that help inform an understanding of the history, geopolitics, theologies of the region, and how Christians should approach thinking about all the complex issues that come up in human rights, alliances, and political affiliations when we're considering that region. Yeah, 9 years now. Yep. So I came here in 2015. I've had a variety of roles at think tanks, working on Capitol Hill, and then advocacy off the Hill to members of Congress, working for donors and in some political races. So I did a variety of things before coming to Philos and finding a real calling in 2020.
That's awesome. I know we share that calling, but I think specifically for what we're going to talk about today and what we talked about with Shadi on the ground, you really understand the Republican base, just working with donors and working with different people in the party. So I think your analysis of Tucker Carlson's recent video will be very insightful. So I just want to jump into that because Tucker Carlson did an interview with Munther Isaac, who is a Palestinian or is he Palestinian, Isaac?
Yes, yeah, he's Palestinian, living in Bethlehem. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. And the interview came out while we were in Israel. And so we were able to talk with Shadi about his experience as a Christian, but I also just want to get your experience as a Christian here in the United States doing work in Israel. So what was your initial kind of response to Tucker and his overall claim that Christians should not support Israel because of Christian suffering at the hands of the Israeli government?
Yeah, so Tucker occupies an interesting space, still mostly right of center, but also has some unorthodox opinions for someone formerly coming from the Republican Party. I think he's got a questioning spirit that is helpful as a journalist to make sure that no dogma goes unquestioned, even from your own side. However, I think sometimes that leads him astray when he's not grounded with either a strong background in the issue himself and he's just asking questions, and then he gives airtime to people who are extremely ideologically rigid in one respect, and he's got no context by which to challenge them or understand really even asking meaningful questions. So I think there's no position or alliance that is unquestionable for an American or a conservative, but the way you go about questioning that with Israel, I think matters. So specifically, I had a lot of issues with his positions. First of all, he framed it as, why should Christians support Israel? And then we go through a litany of critiques from Munther Isaac, who's a radical theologian who's got some pretty unsavory positions. But most of the whole topic wasn't really about Christians in Israel or people in Israel. It was about the Palestinian territories, which exist in a state of armistice, essentially, with Israel, varying levels of cooperation, but Israel does not control them. The stated desire of Palestinians in the West Bank, which is what they're mostly talking about, is to not be controlled by Israel. Yet, failures or issues that Palestinian Christians encounter mostly in the West Bank or in Gaza are being somehow laid at the feet of Israel as if they're in total control, when the whole critique is that they should be less in control. So one concrete example, they talk a lot about Bethlehem, and Tucker mentions a visit he had and finding the town kind of shabby. And I think this is very ironic because prior to the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, the jurisdiction of Bethlehem was controlled by the IDF and by Israel post the 1967 war. And then a part of the Oslo Accords was relinquishing back that control to the Palestinian Authority. That's when you saw a major decline in the quality of life. Treatment of Christians, it's nominally a Christian town by legal jurisdiction, but now Christians are a small percentage of the town, and they've lost between 30 to 40% of their population since Oslo. So indisputably, the state of Christians in Bethlehem was worse when they were more fully controlled by the Palestinian Authority than when they were in control of Israel. I don't know how they kind of dance around that fact, but a myriad of other issues they bring up just fail to acknowledge a few things, like Israel's the only country in the Middle East with a growing population of Christians, where Christians enjoy full rights to practice their religion, to intermarry, to vote, to serve in the military or to not serve in the military. So a few instances of like Christians being spat at on the street, or some issues with like legal classifications over conversion, are somehow put to be this, behemoth of oppression that should have Christians question support for Israel, when everything happening under the Palestinian Authority and all these other Muslim countries, which would be the ones ruling Israel if Munther Isaac were to get his side, all of that's ignored in favor of a few very small issues.
And it's interesting too that you mentioned the Tucker's take on the shabbiness of Bethlehem. He's kind of in recent like journalism used that as like urban life as a litmus test for corruption in a country. And I think he was trying to illustrate that as reflecting the Israeli government's neglect in Bethlehem, when, as you mentioned, that's not representative of who is governing that part of the West Bank. And I think that's just reflective of Tucker's entire interview, which is misleading. And I would maybe argue to the point of being intellectually dishonest or negligent as a journalist. Why do you kind of touched on this, but why do you think he's taken a position that largely diverges from the Republican base? Obviously, he's kind of been challenging the elite establishment. I think it comes from also a very isolationist slant with his foreign policy. Maybe you could elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah. So ideologically, he will admit this, that he feels a lot of shame for the brief period of time that he supported the Iraq war. So he supported it initially, then he was on the ground covering it, later changed his opinion, and I think since soured on the vast majority of American intervention. And I think that's a prudential debate conservatives or Christians can have. I don't think it should be ruled out of a party or a movement for that position. However, that skepticism he has towards intervention, he now applies towards Israel with like the same level of vitriol, essentially. Like basically, if American money and arms are going to a place, it's probably to line the pockets of the industrial complex, and it's corrupt, and there's probably something wrong with the regime. You see how he does this in Ukraine and other countries. And again, you can take those case by case, but he basically starts now with the assumption that there's malfeasance on the part of the American government, and then kind of works backward to see why in a given case that's true. He has this with NATO. He has this with a lot of different things. And, you could argue each of those to say, are you right or wrong? But the whole posture, I think, was problematic because he demonstrates he's pretty ignorant about the issue. He doesn't know much about the life of it. And that's fine if you're asking questions and you have both sides, but he's ignorant, and then letting his ignorance be filled by a extremely slanted position on the, anti-Israel side by Munther Isaac, and then just kind of takes it. He goes so far at some point to say, like, if any Christians are mistreated or killed in Gaza during the conflict, no, single dollar of American aid should go over there. If we had that standard in alliances of allies attacked, responding with military force, and the loss of any innocent life by a party he claims to care about, Christians, and then we were to just cease our alliance, we would have literally no allies. There's no country on the planet that would pass that test. It doesn't mean it's not a good aspiration, but to say Christians are somehow like betraying their own in America by being allied with a country that might have, accidentally had people harmed in a bombing that hit part of a church in Gaza when there was military arms close to that site. It's just not it's not a serious foreign policy. It would be great if we could operate in the world with total purity and only pick allies that were going to have completely flawless military campaigns. But that's just not the world we live in.
Hmm. And I think also it ignores the plight of indigenous Christians across the entire region at the hands of Islamic fundamentalism. And there's a complete blind eye to that. So I think there's also an inconsistency in trying to champion Christians in the region and not looking to the West Bank, where Munther Isaac's from, and then just also the larger Arab region at large. But I completely agree, Isaac. Um, and so both of us are Christians. We obviously travel to Israel quite a bit, leading these trips with PLI. What has your experience been as a Christian traveling in Israel, and then also in speaking to Christians who live in Israel, and how is that reality so different from the one that Tucker painted and portrayed in his interview?
Yeah, I think I just think he totally misses it because when you go there, I think most Christians feel a deep sense of connection and almost like home when they're in Israel. The common language we have of Judeo-Christian references, Bible quotations, Psalms, all of these various things that we just share in common with that culture. All of that on its own, what I think give us a connection. Christians specifically, what I see is a lot of vitality and thriving and health, objectively in that they're growing demographically, but especially by contrast. We were up in northern Israel in a town called Jish with a group of Aramaean Christians, and we hear these tragic stories about their cousins who will be across the border in Lebanon or Syria, the same ethnicity, same religious branch, but radically different lives, radically different opportunities. And that's all down to the country they're living in. So it's reality. I mean, Tucker can have on whoever he wants, but if you talk to actual Christians on the ground, ask them where else in the Middle East would you rather live? Also, where in the world would you rather live? Because Middle Eastern Christians tend to have an easier time immigrating to the US or to Britain or other places because they're targets of persecution. But there's an intentional desire when they can to stay rooted in those communities. These are ancient Semitic Christians going back to the time of Christ, and they don't operate purely off of economics. So they're choosing to stay, and the one place they choose to stay would be under the rule of Israel. And I think that's just the ultimate testament. Where do the people you claim to care about actually vote with their feet to be? Um, and I've seen such a range of practice among, you know, uh, Messianic Jewish Christians, Aramaean Christians, Protestants, Orthodox, Catholics. There's massive, really every branch of Christianity in the world thrown together in this place, and the one place in their region of origin in the Near East that they can actually thrive and have a sense of equality.
And I think in closing in our portion of the segment before we pan back to our interview with Shadi in Israel on the ground from last week, I just want to kind of have a conversation with you about one of Tucker's biggest, I think, points of contention, which was that Christians can't evangelize in Israel. And I really want to break that down. And first off, point off the hypocrisy. Because Christians in Islamic society are dhimmi, they're second class citizens. And so they quite literally have that legal and social designation. But also, there's a great legacy just of Jews in the diaspora experiencing anti Semitism in Europe, the Holocaust, which has led to this position on not wishing to be evangelized to, because there's this integral connection between your Jewish faith and your Jewish ethnic identity that many Jews around the world feel threatened by when Christians might try to evangelize to them. So I just wanted you to speak to that and kind of talk about how that plays out on the ground, because you can freely express and worship as a Christian. There's just that respect for no evangelism. So I don't know if you could speak to that.
Yeah, yeah. There's a long, long history even before the Holocaust of Jews being forcibly converted. The converso incidents under the Spanish monarchies was particularly horrible, where they would kidnap children. There was forced baptism, and a lot of things that I don't think any Christian now would justify as morally permissible. So that's the cultural legacy they come into this as. They don't see it simply as, hey, someone has hope. They have a reason for the hope within us, as First Peter 3:15 tells us, and I don't want to hear that. It's a matter of cultural and military and political forces throughout history in the countries they lived in, imposing on them whatever religion it was: Christianity in the West, Islam in the East, other places. So that's the context for it, not American missionaries necessarily. But the law and practice is essentially more will kind of discourage things like massive street preaching, large scale things that are targeted with only that intent. And in an ideal world, I think we'd see whatever forms people want to do of evangelization. But I think you have to have respect for where they're coming from and that they actually guarantee the right of Christians to exist. And also through the more effective forms of evangelism, in my own opinion, which are personal relationships, conversations. There's no ban on that. There's no law against that. People all the time will share their perspectives. We met multiple Messianic Jews just in passing at restaurants and other places while we were over there. They exist. There are multiple Messianic Jewish and other Christian organizations that exist in Israel with their headquarters for the purpose of evangelization. So a lot of it too is kind of a tacit law that's rarely enforced. But the basic point of it is simply to try to have a Jewish identity preserved after centuries of oppression. That doesn't share actual people from seeking truth if they want it or asking people honest questions about their faith. So I think it's really a total misnomer. And as you said, completely ironic, especially from anybody coming on the Palestinian side. Christians in Israel growing in the West Bank and Gaza and most Muslim countries, they are literally doomed to shrink because they're only allowed to marry within their own communities. So necessarily, like, that kind of limits the bloodlines. Oftentimes they have to immigrate. But if a Christian wants to marry a Muslim, they literally cannot unless they become Muslim. No Muslim can become Christian and marry a Christian. So they're forced to this demographic decline. They don't enjoy, rights of practice. Literally, if you walk into a church in the West Bank, I met with a pastor who was sharing this, and you say, as a Muslim, I want to hear about Jesus and accept him. If that pastor engaged in the conversation, he would literally be put in prison or killed, depending on the area. And these are the people, this is the person, Munther Isaac, who is critiquing Israel for not wanting like mass scale street preaching. I just think it's massively missing the forest for the trees. And you really can't claim to care about the plight of Christians when you want a regime that has that treatment of Christians to be in control of the one free place that does exist in the Middle East, Israel. And by definition, they would then be under those same laws and cursed with the, obvious decline that his own congregation or people would have been seeing. So it's completely disingenuous.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I also view that kind of tacit law, as you said, as almost a mechanism of pluralism that allows Jews to worship, Muslims to worship, and Christians to worship, which is, I think, indicative of just the complex cultural and ethnic and religious identities that comprise the region that someone in the West would probably not really have context for. And so I think, as you noted, Tucker doesn't have that context, or he chose not to inform himself of those kind of complex intersecting identities in the region that contribute to policies like this in Israel.
Just that point, I think in conclusion, Tucker in that interview was either guilty of profound ignorance on the topic or being disingenuous by who he chose to highlight and let, spew an inaccurate overall picture. I hope that it's the first and he just needs to learn more about the issue. We have a lot of people at Philos and elsewhere who can share more, and we know actual Christians in the hundreds on the ground in Israel that would love the chance to refute some of the claims that were on there. So I hope his guest does not get his way and see the situation of most Middle Eastern Christians become the reality for Christians in Israel, which now have freedom.
I couldn't agree more. And this next segment is going to be from our conversation on the ground. Thank you so much, Isaac. Shadi, I want to ask you a few questions as we're standing in Israel as a Christian tourist coming to see the land, and then you're a Maronite Christian living here. Can you speak to broadly just the ethnic cleansing of indigenous Christians in the Middle East under Arab regimes and why Israel is a refuge for Christians in the region?
Okay, well, as you all know, the Middle East was inhabited by majority of Christians until the 7th century. And what happened in the 7th century? The Islamic Arab conquest that started from Arabia, which is the Arab Peninsula, invasion that started from there, and it actually made ethnic cleansing for Christian population. And for 1,400 years, this is still happening in this region. Even now, in the Middle East, we saw that lately by ISIS in Iraq. We saw it in Syria. We are seeing it even in Lebanon. Just 2 days ago, they killed Hezbollah, terrorist radical Islamic Shia Iranian group, killed a Christian citizen activist of the Lebanese forces, and they actually killed them for no reason, just for being part of a Christian Lebanese Forces Party. And that's what Hezbollah is doing for the Christians in Lebanon. He's trying to control the only Christian country that was founded by Christians to be safe haven for them in this Middle East and a refuge for them. And unfortunately, it's not. And that's the same scenario in the West Bank under a Palestinian Authority. We see it since Arafat took over in Oslo Agreement and he was handed Bethlehem to him. We saw the Bethlehem Christian community start shrinking and diminishing and leaving the Bethlehem, the only holy place for Christians in the West Bank. Here in Israel, we are actually enjoy, opposite to them, the freedom of our state. We live here in the Galilee, in this beautiful Galilee. We can speak freely, we can act freely, we move freely, we worship our God freely. We do everything we need freely without fear of anyone being oppressing us or anyone being harassing our women or our ladies or our believers. And that's the freedom we enjoy in Israel. Now, yes, there are some incidents, we saw them lately and we cannot deny it. Those incidents are a really tiny majority, even not 1% of the Jewish people, of radical group, specific radical group, even not 0.5% of the population, that most Jews oppose them. While in the other side, under Arab regimes and Arab cities, Christians who are being harassed and oppressed are the other side, the Muslim side is not being caught and held to justice or brought to justice. Here in Israel, we take those oppressors or those harassing people and put them in jail. That's the difference. That's what we need to address in our speech today or in any other interview. The freedom we enjoy here and the law that we actually enjoy in Israel that protecting us as citizens of the State of Israel.
And just a few days ago, the Philos Project was on the border of Lebanon. We were with Maronite Christians in Israel who live freely, they get to worship freely, and we were able to see into Lebanon where Christians are not able to. You mentioned in your opening Pasquale Suleiman.
Yes, Pasquale Suleiman.
Could you maybe elaborate a little bit more specifically on what happened with Pasquale and how Christians in Lebanon live in fear of Hezbollah?
Well, what happened with Pascal is a continuous oppression and deterioration of the Christian situation in Lebanon. Pascal was killed by Hezbollah terrorists, Islamic terrorists, who are actually kidnapped him from his car in his own Christian region where he lived. The majority of that region is Christians. Hezbollah is infiltrating this region. Those terrorists kidnap him by stopping his car while driving his car in a junction. When he just slowed his car, they stopped. They kidnapped him in front of the eyes of his friend and took him all the way to Syria, killed him there, and now there's a big unrest in Lebanon and the Christians cannot take it anymore and they are demonstrating against Hezbollah, asking this terror organization to step down and leave their country because they already controlling Lebanon and Christians cannot even appoint a president. That it is actually this position is preserved for a Christian Maronite personality. They cannot appoint a president because of this oppression, Iranian occupation of Lebanon with the proxy, the strongest proxy of Hezbollah. So this is why I said it's continuous oppression, because few months ago they killed another guy. He's called as Elias Hasrouni in South Lebanon in the same method, by stopping his car, kidnapping him, killed him, and a month later they killed his wife. Okay, and this is happening in a daily basis. They already killed 4 Christians who opposing Hezbollah, and they killed Christian leaders who opposed Hezbollah in the past, and they continue to do it until today. So what do you expect from the Christians to do? To keep looking at them and telling them, oh, come kill us and evacuate or migrate us from this land? This is our land. This is our land. That's what we see in Lebanon. Here in Israel, if this would happen, my friends, the state police will go catch those people, put them in jail, and those people will not even be able to see the sun. Because we have a law of order here. We have democracy, we have courts that functioning, while Lebanon, sorry, it become a failure country under this Islamic Arab Hezbollah radical group of what we call Iranian proxy.
And just to clarify, point of clarification, Tucker Carlson's interview was talking about Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, but that same Ayatollah's ideology that drives Hezbollah also drives Hamas, so it's a comparable example. Well, Shadi, thank you very much for sharing your perspective, and we'll continue to pray for the Christian community here in Israel, which is really the only safe haven left for the indigenous Christians in the region. So thank you for all of the work that you're doing.
And thank you, Dominique. Thank you for Philos Project and for all you're doing for us as Christians in the land, for integrating us and helping us actually thrive more within the state of Israel. Thank you.
And Tucker Carlson, this is your official invite to come to Israel with the Philos Project and visit the Maronite Christians here to see for yourself. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.